Okay, good morning everyone. As you can see, we have 4 speakers for the opening panel for this conference. First off is Theo Papadopoulos. He is from the University of Bath, UK. He will be speaking on power shifts in the European Union, continuities, changes and crises in the integration of European market societies. Second, we have Francesco Macheda. He is based in York. He's just based in York for 1 semester, but he's a visiting scholar from Italy. He will be speaking on the role of pension funds in the financialization of the Icelandic economy. Next, we have Sandy Brian Hager of York University. His presentation is entitled "Who Bears the Burden? Public Debt, Redistribution and Power." And last off, we have j.a.francis from the London School of Economics. He will be speaking on actually existing states, the gaping hole in the state theory. Each speaker will have 20 minutes to present, and I'd like to ask each panelist to speak directly into the mic, so all that they say is well recorded. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, good morning, everybody. It's very nice to be here. I'm Theo Papadopoulos from the University of Bath, and today what I'm going to talk about is my take on what is happening at the European Union level with regards to various modes of integration of European societies, market societies. I entitled my presentation "Power Shifts in the European Union" because I do believe that we have some substantial power shifts taking place in the EU, and that's why I'm going to try to give you some empirical results, findings, if you like, where we can reflect upon these power shifts, but also an attempt to an analytics of power that I have been developing for some time now that complements, I think, much of the work that is done here. The content of my presentation. First, I will start with a conceptual framework. I'm going to try to discuss 3 key concepts for my research. The concept of power, the concept of market embeddedness, and the idea of governance not as an object of analysis, but governance as an approach to analyzing social and economic and political phenomena. Then I'm going to give very briefly, because we don't have a lot of time, 3 empirical cases that I think are useful in understanding what kind of shifts we have are taking place at the moment in the European Union. So I will start with what I call towards an analytics of power. What I will present you is the result of trying to distill all sorts of different literatures that span a wide range of fields, a wide range, well, they span across time, and also a variety of scholars coming from perspectives like political theory, welfare state theory, politics, international political economy, etc. Some of you might already recognize some names here. Some of these names are with us today. Bob Jessup, for instance. I'm taking a sociological, if I can use that term, sociological understanding of power, moving a little bit further from the traditional politics. And what I will give you in brief now is how do I try to make sense of power? Effectively, I say that power is a dynamic. We cannot have power. What we can have is power resources that we can mobilize. What we can do is exercise power, and we can exercise power in different dimensions, as well as every time we exercise power contains, if you like, these 3 dimensions, is exercised in these 3 dimensions. One is what I call the relational dimension of power, what I call the instituted power. The other one is the structural dimension, and the third one is the discursive dimension, the symbolic ideational dimension. The distinction between power and power resources is important because what I have found in my own readings in the literature is that very often people conflate the two, the power and the power resources. They talk about people having power. What they actually mean, I think, is that what people have is power resources, and they are context-specific. You can utilize some power resources at a point in time in a particular context, but in another point in time, under a different context, you might not be able to exercise, to mobilize these resources. So what's the relational dimension of power? Here we just have the very simple and more visible, if you like, understanding of power between social agents within a given set of instituted rules that constitute a field of social action. And I borrow the term here from Bourdieu and Flickstein in terms of what is a social field. I don't have time to explain later, but I put in the appendix of this presentation some quotations that explain what I mean. It's what I call the instituted power. So I'm interested in power asymmetries, I'm interested in power shifts, how we can actually empirically capture that. So I see them as differences in the volume of power resources that the social agent can mobilize and the relative effectiveness within the rules of the field. So that's one dimension, if you like, the instituted power. The instituting dimension of power, the structural dimension, is the reproduction or alteration of the very institutions, the field within which the dynamic between the social agent takes place. Every time we mobilize resources, we also make a contribution to the alteration or change, or if you like, maintenance of the particular order. So when we actually capture that, we capture the dynamics in terms of the instituting capacity of social agents, how far social agents have the capacity to mobilize resources in order to change the rules of the game. The third one is the symbolic discursive dimension, and this is where, again, what we have is the capacity to alter or reproduce the social categories that agents use in terms of in exercising their power, and the way they represent the corresponding fields in which they act. So if we're looking at power asymmetries here, we look at differences in the discursive capacity to maintain or alter categories of social meaning, within which the other two dimensions are also understood. So in that respect, it's a little bit different. My conception is try to kind of create a more rich and unified space than the very traditional understandings of power that we have in politics. I summarize here what I just said. Agents are acting in socio-historical conditions. Power is a dynamic. It is exercised at the symbolic level, cannot be reduced to it. It involves the capacity of to structure action, as well as the capacity to mobilize resources for own action or blocking other actors' actions. I also say that power resources can be grouped into discursive, structural, and instituted. They are context-sensitive, but their context sensitivity seems to vary. Sometimes context is important, and sometimes it seems to be less important. Across dimensions, if they mobilize across in concert across the dimensions. The second concept I'm going to use is the concept of embeddedness. It comes from Polanyi. Again, I just don't want to spend a lot of time on that. I'm pretty sure people are aware of the work of Polanyi and how he used the concept. There are problems with some of the, although it's a very interesting and good concept, there are problems with the concept of embeddedness and disembeddedness. This has been identified by quite a few authors. Fred Block is one of them. He says that even when we have what is called disembedded markets, i.e. markets that they seem to move out of the conditions, the rules, and the governance structures of society, and they take a life of their own, if you like. Even then, what we have is regulations that allow this to happen. So Block argues that we cannot have totally disembedded markets. We always have markets that are regulated. The point is, what is the form of regulation? What is the mode of regulation? So what we are interested in is then to see how the markets are regulated and re-regulated and re-regulated. In that respect, we cannot have deregulated markets. We always have regulated markets that are regulated in a different way to serve different purposes. And here's a quotation from Block. And why is this important? Well, it is because it's important, because, and that meets I think some of the work that the authors of the book Capital as Power, the point is because with that we move away from this idea that we can have this kind of mechanisms that somehow they are completely out of the regulatory structures. We can, if we keep from Polanyi the idea that market is an instituted process, rather than natural equilibria, etc., then because we end up with making accountable, at the end of the day, the men and women who exercise power behind the protection of the market myth. We expose the market myth. We say it cannot survive without the regulation, and therefore the people who are actually exercising these regulations are accountable. So we bring, if you like, the deepest, the political, if you like, dimension in, and that meets also the work of Castoriadis as well, who talks about society as a self-instituting process and all that. So that's why I'm interested in this concept of embeddedness. And if we want to understand the disembedded markets, and I put it in quotes so that we understand that this is, with reference to the marketization processes, power is central to our understanding forms of market embeddedness and disembeddedness and re-embeddedness. And this is where, we can see, for instance, that what is interesting is if you're looking at the current drive in the EU, where national market societies that have a plurality, there's a pluralism of different forms of governance and embeddedness of markets, are now based, if you like, there's an attempt to put them now into a European framework, where it's, the situation is that what emerges is a disembedded transnational market structure. Then what we can see there happening is that not only we have an attempt to economize these social spaces, but also make the mode of instituting, the logics of the ways in which institutions are made in these societies, also marketized. It's economization as a mode of social instituting of that space, and in that space, in my case, is the European Union. And again, power is central to understanding what's happening. Now, governance as an approach. Why is governance is important? I said before that governance, for me, is not an object of analysis. I'm not interested in this idea of good governance, bad governance, fairy governance, whatever. It's not an object of analysis. Governance can be used as an approach to analyze this phenomena. And we can, I'm taking here some of the work that I've done with another colleague of mine, Emma Carmel, where we described it as a form of political regulation, initiated, organized, and partially controlled by an actor or actors vested with a political authority. But centrally, that's what I think governance brings into. It involves the steering of the social subjects' behavioral practices towards particular social and political-economic goals. It might look obvious, that's what governance is, but that has some interesting implications when it comes to analytics. If we think about policies as the ways in which governance, if you like, is crystallized, if we analyze these policies, in my view, we have to analyze them not only in terms of their formal content, what they actually, the legislation and the regulations embody, in terms of unemployment policy or economic policy or whatever, but also about the mode of doing policy. What exactly is the organizational arrangements and procedures of policy delivery that create this kind of operational aspect, if you like. This is absolutely central, and I think the concept of governance captures that. It brings these two together. We don't have this difference between implementation and policy formulation or whatever. What we have is a concept that allows us to analytically distinguish between formal and operational, but bring them together, because, again, the logic is very important. If the operational policy creates, if you like, puts into the genome, if you like, of the instituting of society, the idea, the seed of the market all the time, that's an important aspect that we have to capture. Not only what is happening formally, but what's happening in terms of the management, if you like, of that activity. Okay, so now I'm going to, I'm a bit aware of the time, so I just want to, anyway, I just want to skip that slide because of time. I just want to say a little bit more about my cases now. So what we can take from these three, power as a dynamic across these three different dimensions, market embeddedness and re-embeddedness as this kind of continuous struggle, if you like, in market and capitalist societies, to embed, disembed, and embed the markets. And thirdly, governance as a kind of an approach. My attempt is actually to bring them all together in studying some cases. And the first one, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time, because I think you might be interested more in the other two, is what I call the nearly completed recommodification of European labor and the workfarization, marketization of national welfare states. Now, most of you probably are aware of the literature and what has happened in the last 15, 20 years in Western European welfare states. Clearly, we have the reduction of many of the social rights, the compression, if you like, of many of the social rights, labor rights, entitlements that used to characterize a lot of European welfare states in different degrees, but the trajectory is pretty evident. If I could put, I have to apologize in advance for the next slide. Oh, no, not this one, sorry, this one. If I can put it in a kind of periodization, this is very tentative. What we have is a process by which, after the Second World War, we have welfare statism until about 70s, mid-70s. Then we have a pro-market statism rising between, these are all modes of governance, from 1980s to 1990s. A kind of social liberal governance that turned welfare states into workfare regimes that we can identify, if you like, up to up to 2007, I suppose. And then gradually what we have is the emergence of what I think is happening here is a transnational market polity. I call it a transnational market polity. And I will explain later what I mean by that term. But roughly, this is what empirically I think it can safely be supported about the direction of the changes. Now this one, and again I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but is a very complicated slide. Unfortunately I couldn't do it in any other way. It will take us ages to go through all the other slides individually. But I'm trying to capture in these three dimensions that I explained to you earlier, what has happened post-World War up to the 80s, and then after that in the 90s onwards. And what we have very briefly is that at the discursive level, after the Second World War, we had labor, state, and capital in Europe mutually recognizing each other as social, political, and economic agents. This was product of democratization of capitalism, politicization of economic relations, etc. What we have later is that the state and capital are recognized as agents, but not labor. Labor gradually loses its capacity to fight, if you like, for its own concepts. Labor gradually is getting reified. It's something to be activated. Yeah, social rights related to its protection are discursively constructed as obstacles, and they have to be removed for the efficient functioning of the market. At the instituting level, again, the same story works in parallel. Institutions and policies crystallize a consensus, the social democratic consensus of the old style, as protection from the market. In the new regimes, protection is hollowed out. Social protection becomes conditional support, and the structural instituting capacity vis-à-vis the state and capital are reduced. And of course, in terms of relational, the story follows the same route. At the end of now, every time labor confronts capital in Europe, seems to be in the back foot, and many times actually a lot of steps back. The second case is what I call the adoption of meta-regulation as a form of governance of European industrial relation. I only have a few minutes, so I'm basing that into a couple of cases that there are rulings of the European Court of Justice. These are the rulings in the cases of Laval and Viking. I don't have a lot of time to go through these rulings, but effectively, what has happened is that the European Court of Justice was there were some labor disputes. Basically, the labor unions in one country were complaining that there were companies bringing labor from other European countries, and instead of complying to the national regulations of the country, they were using the national regulations of the other country, the country of origin. So in Sweden, you have somebody, let's say, a company building a school, using Estonian workers that they were operating under Estonian rules and not under the Swedish rules. Of course, for the Swedish unions, that was an anathema. They took the case to their own courts. The Swedish employers supported the Estonians, the Estonian company. The case went to the European Court of Justice, and the European Court of Justice ruled against the Swedish unions, saying that the principle of competition across the EU is more important than the right to national strikes and bargaining, etc., than the local rules. They created a hierarchy, if you like, of values. I call that meta-regulation. Is a term that has been used in some legal texts. Effectively, what you have is a regulation by proxy, basically by the court making decisions and effectively creating what we can call a market for national regulations in Europe. Now companies can go anywhere that is nice for them and establish there, and then bring their workers and bid for contracts in other European countries. And we have continuous now case upon case in the European Union where the European Court of Justice rules against that. And just to give you how tragic this is for the trade unions, the European Trade Union Congress, ETUC, which is not famous for its radicalism, it says that the score is now 4 or 5-0. 5 for the employees, 0 for the unions. They are losing one case after the other. The very last one, and I'm going to finish here, is the establishment of what I call the European Stability Mechanism. This is something that not a lot of people know about. I'll start very quickly with a quote that you probably have heard. You never let a serious crisis go to waste. That's what happened here. We have a serious financial crisis in Europe, enveloping the Euro countries. Hey, what a great idea now. We can bring in a form of federalism that is totally unaccountable. The creation of the European Stability Mechanism means, very, very briefly, that from now on, each country that goes under this mechanism, each of the Euro countries that goes under this mechanism, and asks for help, the first one will be Greece, of course, they will be under conditions of strict conditionality. Their budget will be written in Brussels and in Frankfurt, basically. That's the end of the parliamentary democracy as we understand it. It's almost like a complete a perversion, if you like, of the idea of democratic Europe. It's completely the opposite. I can go into details about that, but I just want to conclude now. Now, we can identify these 3 power shifts at the national space of action, at the cross-national space of action, and between member states. I think there's a continuous drive towards democratically disembedded markets in the EU. We have the creation of what I call the creation of state market for state regulation, and various innovations that clearly try to disembed, if you like, or enclose the national states into disembedded, if you like, structures. What I think is emerging is the market becomes the logic, if you like, of instituting in the EU. It permeates, it's almost like mainstream. Every institution has to be market compatible, if I can say that. And I think this is a kind of evolution. This is a very interesting moment for capitalism. It's evolving into, market is evolving into a form of polity, a fused socio-political and economic governance. To use the metaphor from Mumford, a mega machine that is now gradually emerges. Of course, we know that resistance is always there. I think that it is now the moment where the stakes for alternative democratic pre-order, to use that term, are probably the highest in recent history. The crisis that started in Greece, but it will continue with the other countries, is going to bring up all these issues. My fear is that authoritarianism and capitalism go well, but democracy and capitalism do not. And very often is the second that, it's authoritarianism and capitalism that we are facing, not democracy and capitalism. So I'll stop here. There's a lot more to say, but I think that's enough. Thank you.
In this presentation, I will discuss about the decisive role of the pension funds in the restructuring of the Icelandic economy. My point is that through its involvement in the pension fund industry, the labor unions greatly concurred in laying the foundation to the economy financialization, defined as the pattern of accumulation in which profit-making occurs increasingly through financial channels rather than through trade and commodity production. On the one hand, the socio-economic stability provided by the labor unions enhanced the economic credibility of the country. And this, in turn, helped the internal market to attract foreign speculators in Iceland, and also to gain access to loans from international markets. But on the other hand, the pension funds not only benefit from this stability, but also stimulated strong demand for new channels of speculative investments. I decided to focus on the trade unions and pension funds because many of the articles that have tried to inquire into the Icelandic collapse provide merely subjective or contingent explanation of the very causes behind this collapse, like weak business culture of the Icelandic society, risky expansion strategies pursued by the banks, and so on. The problem is that also the heterodox literature does not substantially depart from the orthodoxy. For instance, for Robert Waite and Silla Sigurgeirsdóttir, the neoliberal wave that struck Iceland is only attributable to a dozen or so men studying law or business administration at the University of Iceland during the 70s. And this refashionated their societies as a neoliberal model when they moved into position of power. It's clear that all these approaches don't take into account the fact that markets cannot create the various prerequisites that are necessary for the implementation. And one of the crucial institution prerequisites that matters most in the social construction of financial markets is the occupational pension funds, whose development appears as a key component in forging a broad class alliance in favor of neoliberal restructuring. As Dumenil and Levy pointed out, occupational pension funds are a key institution that interlinks the unions, employers, and government's action. They are a central mediating mechanism between industrial restructuring, the labor force consensus for economic liberalization, and growth of the financial markets. In this presentation, in the first part, analyze the interrelationship between the Icelandic pension funds model and the financialization of the economy. And in the second part, I retrace how the implementation of a neo-corporatist pattern enabled lower inflation and currency stabilization. My point is that the consensus of the Icelandic trade unions concerning the neoliberal policy that reshaped the Icelandic economy since the early 90s relies on their involvement in the management of a financial entity, and specifically on their needs to sustain and recover its profitability. Whoa. In a small market context, as Iceland is, the pension funds are one of the most important players in the financial markets in the country. As you can see in this figure, pension fund assets experience an endless growth since the 80s, reaching an astonishing share of 133% of GDP in 2007, and at the same time, the workers' retirement savings on total domestic savings soared to more than 30% in 1997, even higher than the bank's saving share. And this provided a fundamental source of liquidity that underpinned the financial industry in Iceland. But what is important to remark here is that as one of the largest saving institutions of the country, the pension funds stimulated strong demand for new channels of speculative investments. And this, as the current director of the Central Bank of Iceland said, has contributed strongly to the development of the financial and stock market in Iceland. The preference for equities amongst pension funds in Iceland has both historical and institutional roots. Firstly, the Icelandic pension system is one of the more privately oriented among the Nordic countries. In Iceland model, payments under public pay-you-go system when the financial market do not play a relevant role are very low by international standards. But on the other hand, the most significant deviation of the Icelandic pension fund system from other Nordic systems is the dominant rule for occupational pillar in which financial market play instead a key role in the accumulation of funded provisions. In other words, the benefit level depends here on the performance of financial markets in which these funds are invested. The legal framework affects the investment decisions of the occupational pension funds. Firstly, the weak regulatory regime allows this fund to be invested in very speculative activities. For instance, pension funds in Iceland play a crucial role in financing an housing bubble that through their purchase of a massive quantity of mortgage bonds issued by the Icelandic banks since 2003. For instance, in 2007, pension funds in Iceland had more than 40% of the stock of housing bonds. But what is more important is the design of the Icelandic system of pension. As you can see in this table, the bulk of the Icelandic occupational plans operate much like defined contribution schemes, as usually happens in the neoliberal countries, rather than like defined benefit plans, as is the case for other Scandinavian countries without Denmark. The problem is that under this model, under the defined contribution model, there is no commitment regarding benefits. Employers, in fact, don't bear the risk that the return from these funds will be sufficient to provide for workers' material well-being, security, and freedom in retirement. And the outcome is that occupational pension funds that operate like defined benefit contribution very often invest in very risky speculation, where high or low incomes depends strongly on the financial market forces. And third, people, or even better, the trade unions that manage this fund are encouraged to think of themselves like shareholders rather than members of a mutual organization. In this figure, in this graph, you can see the pension funds asset allocation, composition, and the way it changed in 1995 and 2005. As you can see, the share of equity had strongly increased to almost 50% in only 10 years. This was at the expense of far more safe fixed income securities. At the same time, the proportion of foreign assets, the bulk of them were in form of equity and share invested in mutual funds, jumped to almost 25% in only 10 years. The importance of pension funds for the domestic financial markets is highlighted by the ratio of pension funds assets to market capitalization. In Iceland, this ratio equaled more than 150% in 2003. To have an idea, in other very market-oriented economies like United States, United Kingdom, and Australia, this ratio was around 60%. Instead, in the other Scandinavian countries, this ratio, that is the ratio of pension funds assets to market capitalization, was more or less around 10%. The increase of the pension fund size in the national stock market sustained the financialization process of the Icelandic economy. As you can see in this graph, that show the stock market capitalization as a percentage of GDP in Scandinavian countries. In Iceland, this value jumped from around 7% in 1995 to more than 200% 10 years later in 2006. That it was the higher value among the OECD countries. In turn, the money incomes and money stocks have become a systematic source of financial profit. This figure instead show the share of financial profits to total corporate profits. And in Iceland, this share has risen from around 20% in 1997 to almost 60% in 2007. Instead, this ratio, remained more or less steady in the other Nordic countries. Now, one question may be what has got to do this with power and power relationship especially between labor and capital. Well, to understand the role of labor organization in lay the foundations for financial capital to erupt, we have to briefly describe the Icelandic model, and especially the crisis that this system experienced since the middle 80s. Iceland's development path was characterized by one-sided export specialization. Here, the great openness of the economy affected the rule of the exchange rate, in the sense that all along the post-war period, the governments, both conservative and social democratic, paid emphasis of the devaluation of the currency as an anti-cyclical policy to support the profitability of the export industry, especially in the fish sector. And as you can see in this picture, the method that policymakers adopt was to use, in a context of full employment, that is the yellow line, wage flexibility as a buffer against external shocks. That is the red line. That is the blue line that resembles the GDP fluctuation. But it's clear that this model boosts social stability due to the fact that employment relationships were not isolated but had to adapt in reaction to the changes in international markets. And in this table, you can see, especially in the last column, that endemic conflictuality all along has characterized the Icelandic labor movement. This table showed that they lost for 1,000 employees for strike, and in Iceland these values was almost 50 times higher than in Sweden and more than 25 times that in Norway. However, because of a series of events like the collapse of Bretton Woods and the profitability crisis in the fisheries sector, towards the end of the 80s, the valuation policies became more and more difficult to protect due to its inflationary bias that and the very strong strike activity that followed. In these two pictures, you can see the level of strike activity and the inflation rate in Nordic countries, and you can see that in Iceland it's much more high than other countries. Following the crisis in the ends of the 80s, the 1988, it became possible for the Confederation of Labor in the private sector to deter individual unions from pursuing militant wage strategies. The goal, both of the trade unions leadership and the employees association, was the implementation of a neo-corporatist framework with the aim to coming out from the vicious cycle of inflation. And you can see the main characteristic of a neo-corporatist pattern of mediation of interest. With three neo-corporatist agreements in the early 90s, inflation decreased from more than 20% to almost 0%. The currency was stabilized, and for the first time in its history, Iceland experienced unemployment. And this went in hand with a massive redistribution of income in favor of profit. As you can see in this figure that showed the share of labor on GDP and the unemployment rate, you can see that starting from the early 90s, there is a huge increase of unemployment and a decrease of labor share on GDP. The problem is that despite this massive redistribution of income, the consumption in fixed capital, that is productive investment, held steady due to the increase in the interest rates. On the contrary, the new economic, social, and political environment provided many opportunities, as we see in the financial sectors. As you can see in this table, especially in the first column, the implementation of a finance-led regime of accumulation was not an impersonal process. Instead, this regime rooted in the defeat of the working class power, or more precisely, in the fact that working class income, when working class in general, was more and more sucked into a vortex of easy indebtedness and economic financialization. With these neo-corporatist agreements, the Icelandic working class went from being one of the most combating to become one of the most quiet ones in the world. From 1990, the annihilation of the class conflict resulted in a substantial drop of inflation that decreased from 40% in the 80s to 4.2% in the 90s and 4.7% in 2000. As a consequence, the interest rates shot upwards more than 10% in the last decade. But what is more surprising, as I mentioned, in this column, this table, is the first column that showed the union density. This variable, in fact, has seen a growing trend by almost 20 points. And this, despite the fact that also in Iceland, conservative, and market-oriented governments has been in power for the most of the last 20 years. Okay, skip this. The consensus of the Icelandic unions concerning the neoliberal policies needs to be understood in the light that AC, that the Confederation of Icelandic Labor, was not only a defense institution for the interest of the workers, but it was also an institution of money, whose main goal was to seek profits. We already said that occupational pension funds were eroded first by the high inflation and later by the lack of profitable investment in the previous decades. On the other hand, the very nature of the occupational pension scheme implies the construction of a power network formed by the elite of labor and the elite of employers. And this means that this power relationship unites two essentially divided groups. And this is the hub of the matter. Labor unions leaders were on both sides of the table. On one end, as worker representatives, they were supposed to bargain for expensive labor policies. But on the other, as members of a financial institution, they became strongly connected to influential members of the neoliberal parties, employers' associations, and financial communities, share with them those policies favorable to boost financial profits that usually are detrimental for workers' interests. And this is one of the central elements and explain why, when the devaluation strategy could not work anymore, the unions and employers who manage them along with the financial sector lobbied successfully to create those structural conditions, that is low inflation, stable currency exchange, that allowed these funds to find new channels to invest in.
Can you conclude soon?
Moving to the conclusion, looking at the problem for a Polanyian and regulationist perspective, the Icelandic case shows how the instauration of a financial expansion was not a natural development, but it was embedded in politics and society. Through its connection with the pension fund industry, Icelandic trade unions coupled to the financial mechanism, because in the last instance they were embedded within it. It would be really interesting to analyze the behavior of trade unions and the strategies of pension fund investments during the current crisis, but I think that we don't have much time. Thank you.
All right. Today I'm going to be presenting some of the research that I've been doing on the redistributionary consequences of public debt. Now, in order for us to wrap our heads around this issue and think about the linkages between public debt and redistribution, I think it's best to start with the basic question that underlies the existing debates, and that is who pays taxes and who receives the interest on government debt. And if the identities of the person or the group who pay taxes is different from those who receive the interest on government debt, then that might mean that the state is acting as a mechanism to redistribute wealth and power from one social group to another. This question of who bears the burden of public debt and who benefits from it has been fiercely debated in political economy since its birth in the 18th century. The classical political economists, for their part, they had very little data to back up the speculative arguments that they made about the redistributionary effects of public debt. But as we know, when we entered the 20th century, the development of national accounting meant that the theories of public debt could be subjected to empirical scrutiny for the very first time. And over the past century, liberals have, to put it mildly, faced severe difficulties in empirically substantiating the theoretical claims that they've developed regarding the links between public debt and redistribution. And the liberal camp has reacted to these difficulties by formulating more restrictive assumptions and more abstract theorizations and using more mathematics, but this hasn't really led to any consensus within the liberal camp on this issue. And unfortunately, contemporary Marxists haven't developed their own methods to explore the link between public debt and redistribution, so that means that there's no radical alternative to challenge the existing liberal frameworks. So what I want to argue today is that the problem with these existing frameworks is that they use economic categories, narrowly economic categories, to explore what is an inherently political issue, and that's the issue of redistribution. And what I'm going to suggest is that we need to rethink and research the linkages between government debt and redistribution, and the way we need to do that is by integrating power into the analysis from the very start. So in the rest of my presentation, I just want to outline the history of political economic thought on the linkages between public debt and redistribution, and then I'll go on to offer an alternative approach, which is based on this notion of capital as power. Okay, so to start with the history of the thinking, we'll start with the classical political economists. And aside from outliers such as Malthus, all of the classics expressed an inherent skepticism towards public debt. They saw it as a negative thing, and this negative view was bound up with their skeptical view of the state. So according to the classical liberal view, the state always acts to distort the self-regulating economy, and one of the major effects of government borrowing was to distort the economy by redistributing wealth from productive industrialists to parasitic financiers, or from current generations to future generations, or from workers to capitalists. And so accordingly, the classical political economists in their policy prescriptions, they called for the minimization of public debt and advocated balanced budgets based on principles of sound finance. Now, this near-liberal consensus on the negative effects of public debt was challenged in the early 20th century. As we know, in the context of the Great Depression, there was a Keynesian revolution, and what Keynes and his followers did was bring into question the idea of the self-regulating market, and they did this within liberal assumptions. And following the Keynesian revolution, the liberal camp was split into three competing theories of public debt. So on the one hand, we had the Keynesian theories, which were referred to collectively as the New Orthodoxy. Then on the other side, we had two neoclassical approaches. One was the public choice theory, and the other was the Ricardian equivalence theory. Now, the main debate between these theoretical perspectives was whether or not the burden of public debt could be shifted forward in time to future generations. So it hinged on the issue of intergenerational redistribution. And as I mentioned in my introduction, what I see as the problem with this debate is that it attempts to address this political issue of redistribution through narrowly economic concepts, categories, and measures. As we know, redistribution involves winners and losers, and this always opens the way to conflict and struggle between social groups. I don't think anyone would dispute that it's a political issue. Now, Keynesians, for their part, they, I think, convincingly refute the arguments about intergenerational redistribution by invoking the government's balance sheet. So what they show is that since a taxpayer's liability is always a bondholder's assets, the two of them, at least in aggregate terms, cancel each other out. But in focusing solely on the aggregate national macroeconomy, Keynesians end up treating the state as a monolithic entity, and this really sidesteps the issue of redistribution between social groups within generations in the here and now. And Keynesians will concede that one of the most important consequences of public indebtedness is that it may redistribute wealth within society. This was a point already recognized by Alvin Hansen in the 1940s. But in the end, they really have no methods to account for it or measure it. Now, the neoclassical approaches, on the other hand, they seem to integrate politics into their analysis of public debt by debating the possible redistributionary conflicts that it creates between generations. But this neoclassical category of generations just ends up being as aggregated as the Keynesian monolithic state. So generations for the neoclassicists, they're comprised not of political actors, but of economic agents who are assumed to have identical interests. So just like Keynesians, the neoclassical frameworks really preclude any chance of analyzing redistribution within generations in the present. So given these conceptual problems, I don't think it's that surprising that liberals have been unable to develop any convincing empirical measures to analyze the redistributionary effects of public debt. And I think in order to explain and map the link between public debt and redistribution, we need to overcome these narrowly economic categories and start thinking about it in terms of power. And the best way to do that, I think, is through a class analysis. And of course, once we mention class, we have to discuss Marx and the Marxists, so I'll turn to that discussion. I think that Marx was the first to examine in a systematic way or in a serious way the link between public debt and redistribution. And in his famous section in Capital Volume 1 on primitive accumulation, he argues that from the development of public debt in the Italian city-states to modern England, the public debt had served to enrich those who provided financing to governments. And since the repayment of public debts was funded out of regressive taxation, Marx argued that it was a key process in the redistribution or expropriation from the masses to the bourgeoisie. And I think Marx is really the pinnacle of thinking about public debt and redistribution in some respects. But since the early 20th century, there's been really no attempt to extend his analysis in any systematic way. And there certainly hasn't been any attempts by Marxists to empirically substantiate the claims that he makes about public debt and class redistribution. I think there's several reasons for this, but because of time constraints, I can't get into them. I think one of the most important reasons is that Marx analyzed public debt within the context of primitive accumulation, so he saw it primarily as a pre-capitalist phenomena, and some, especially orthodox Marxists who read Marx to the letter, might not find it relevant today, or at least in a contemporary context. So, given these problems with the existing approaches and the lack of a radical alternative, I think we have a clean slate with which to theorize and empirically map the linkages between public debt and redistribution. And so now I'm going to turn to outline an alternative approach based on the notion of capitalist power. Now, the starting point for this analysis is private ownership, which Nitzen and Bickler argue is the central power institution in capitalist societies. Now, ownership itself is a claim to future earnings, and it's the control over that income stream that gives capitalists power over any income-generating entity. And that includes the power that bondholders wield over the government. Now, what I'm interested in analyzing is whether or not the owners of public debt are subject to more or less equal claims by the state on their own incomes and consumption through taxation. And if these claims are unequal, then this could mean that the taxation of other social groups is being used to finance the claims of public debt owners, and this may result in redistribution. So my hypothesis, if we put it in those terms, is that as ownership concentration increases, we should expect to see public debt holders wielding more power over government policies, and this may allow public debt holders to steer state policies in ways that redistribute wealth in their favor, for example, through a favorable tax regime. And so in the analysis that I present, there's really three research questions that inform it. The first one is, how much government debt does the ruling class, or what Nitzen and Bickler call dominant capital, own relative to other elements in society? Second question is, what is the historical relationship between the ruling class's claims on the government and the government's own claims on the incomes of the ruling class? And third, does the concentration of government debt ownership have redistributionary consequences? So turning to the data, just like to start by addressing some basic facts about corporate ownership in the US. And that's what I do in Figure 1 on page 3 of your handout. And what this does is it gives us a fairly clear indication of why the US corporate sector is important when analyzing US public debt ownership. And one thing you'll notice about Figure 1 is that it measures government debt as a whole. So that means it includes both state and local as well as federal debt. And the reason I do that is because there's a lack of consistent historical data which breaks down the different levels of government and their indebtedness. But I think that because state and local debt tend to run in tandem with public debt, it's a reasonable measure of public debt ownership. And I think if we adopt a broad definition of the US government, then it's not that unreasonable to use this data. So what stands out here, I think, is a fairly steady ownership of US public debt by US corporations. And since US corporations have consistently controlled almost half of US government debt, it's a good starting point for looking at the issue of concentration. So moving on to the disaggregate data on ownership concentration, what I've tried to do is get a sense of whether or not there has been a growing trend towards concentration in US public debt ownership by corporations. And so the question is whether or not large corporations have come to own a larger share of US public debt over time. And to do this, I've used the IRS's statistics of income. And we can use a number of measures to measure concentration. We can look at it in both distributional or differential terms. And I don't have time to get into that, but you'll find the longhand equations for those measures in Table 1 on page 4. So the distributional measure just looks at the overall percentage share of government debt held by the top asset class of US corporations, which is cut off at 250 million or more, and I'll get more into that later. And the reason I use the cutoff point of 250 million in assets or more is because that's what the IRS does for most years. There's also the differential measure of ownership, which measures the amount of government debt owned per large firm relative to the per firm ownership of a smaller corporation. Now, from the perspective of capitalist power, these differential measures of ownership are the most important because they measure the elemental weight or the per firm power of large corporations relative to other corporations. And if we accept the premise that firms judge their performance and augment their power by beating the average, then that logically leads us towards differential or relative measures. So turning to page 5, you'll find figure 2. What that does is it plots these measures of concentration for government debt ownership by U.S. corporations. And what we see here, I think, is a pretty remarkable trend towards concentration. In distributional terms, the top U.S. corporations held about 46% of the corporate share of government debt in 1954, and that more than doubled to 95% by 2007. Now, in differential terms, so on a per-firm basis, a large corporation held around 1,500 times the amount of government debt compared to a smaller corporation in 1954, and by 2007 they held over 7,000 times as much government debt per firm. So what this suggests is, I think, a staggering pace of concentration in ownership, whether we measure it in terms of distribution or in differential terms. But before drawing too many conclusions from that data, I think it's important to point out one of its major limitations. That brings me to my caveat, and the discussion will get a bit technical, so please just bear with me. Now, the fact that the number of corporations included in these different asset classes fluctuates over time creates a number of complications. And figure 3 on page 6 shows you that the number of corporations included in that top asset class has grown almost twice as fast as the growth in firms within the other asset classes. Now, one obvious problem, if we use the IRS's conventional cutoff point of 250 million in assets or more, is that by 2007, 14,752 incorporations are considered large. And that makes that asset class a fairly poor proxy for dominant capital. In the 1950s, it was useful because it only included 391 firms. But the IRS doesn't refine its categories enough, so it can't really keep up with the changes or the growth in large corporations. Another problem is that someone might look at the dramatic rise in concentration in figure 2 and argue that at least the distributional measure, that's not really concentration, that's just due to the proliferation of firms within that top asset class. And that claim could be dismissed by looking at the differential measure. If that top asset class is being constantly diluted with more firms, then what we would expect is that large corporations, their per firm share of government debt would actually decline and not rise as it's actually done. But just to quell any lingering skepticism in figure 2, I've formulated this little table on page 7, this table 2. Now, to make a long story and boring story short, in 2001, the IRS made a new class of corporations with assets of 2.5 billion or more. And the number of corporations included within that asset class is around 2,400. So that makes it a reasonable proxy for dominant capital. And what table 2 does is it goes back in history to find a period where the number of corporations in the 250 or more asset bracket is roughly equal to the more recent 2.5 billion or more bracket. And using snapshots, we can see that there's still been an undeniable trend towards concentration over the past 3 decades. So in the mid to late 70s, dominant capital owned about 2,000 times the amount of government debt as small firms, and in the 2000s, that tripled to over 6,000 times. So with that in mind, it's really difficult to dismiss the results just based on the fluctuation in the amount of firms within the asset classes. So this brings me now to the question of redistribution and the original hypothesis I mentioned about the potential linkages between growing concentration and redistribution. So as I said, we would expect increasing concentration within government debt ownership to lead to increasing redistribution. Now, ideally, the way you measure this would be to look at the interest payments on government debt and measure them relative to taxation, but unfortunately that data is not available. So I use ownership, which I think is still a reasonable proxy because ownership represents those claims to the interest in the first place. I think the results are quite interesting, and they're plotted on page 9 in figure 4. So what figure 4 does is it takes the differential measure of government debt ownership, which is found in figure 2, so the thick line, and it places it alongside a similar measure for differential taxation, which is the thin line below it. What that differential taxation measures is how much total taxes a large corporation pays in comparison to a small corporation. So what we see here is that, well, government debt ownership has become increasingly concentrated since the 1980s. There's been a slight decline in the differential amount that they pay in taxes. And since increasing ownership concentration has proceeded alongside decreasing taxation of the ruling class, then I think this shows that there has been a fairly clear redistribution of power in favor of dominant capital. So just to conclude, I'd like to say a few words on what we may be able to take away from these graphs, and these comments are largely speculative. I think as a starting point, this is fairly eye-opening, and it may help to shed some light on the recent controversies in the US over fiscal policy in light of the current crisis. Now, with the current crisis and with rising US budget deficits, even some elements of the ruling class, at least the saner elements like Warren Buffett, are calling for a more progressive tax system. But for the most part, these calls for progressive taxation have fallen on deaf ears. And many are blaming the sort of barriers to more progressive taxation on the so-called bond market vigilantes, who people argue will, threaten to vote against any tax changes by liquidating their bond holdings. Now, these are the same bond market vigilantes that were blamed for blocking Bill Clinton's spending programs in the 1990s. And what the research I've presented today suggests is that these bond market vigilantes, if we want to refer to them in that way, are now much more powerful than they were during the Clinton era in the 1990s. And so by revealing these quantitative dimensions of power, this research might, in a modest way, help to explain some of the limited possibilities of fiscal change in the US. Thanks.
Hello, my name is j.a.Francis. I'm from the LSE, where I'm a MPhil PhD candidate in economic history. I'd like to say thank you for having me here. As a historian, I generally try to avoid theory. We historians generally like facts, figures, ideas are kind of like the plague. Nevertheless, we do recognize that at times ideas are necessary. And today I'm going to talk a bit about theory then, in particular state theory. My basic argument is going to be that our standard definition of the state isn't particularly relevant for large periods of history and for large parts of the world today. Therefore, actually existing states, both today and in the past, form a gaping hole in state theory. So the basic question I'm looking at is, what is the state? I think if you're going to look at this question, you need to start with this fellow. He's Max Weber, and I'm going to argue that basically pretty much all our definitions of the state are the same as his, even when they come from people who claim to be critical of him. This is the classic form of his definition. The state is the form of human community that successfully lays claim to the monopoly of legitimate physical violence within a particular territory. In his classic work, Economy and Society, he gives a bit more of an elaborate definition of what he means. In effect, he's talking about He's talking about a legal order in which the administrative staff are also controlled by regulations. So he's basically assuming that the state has the rule of law. It's a legal order. Now, I think to understand Weber's definition, you need to put it in the context of his times. Here's some archival photos. You've got the Reichstag being opened in 1894. You've got Weber himself up there with various men in suits. You've got politicians from the Social Democratic Party. Here's Werner Sombart in the middle, men in suits, and you've got Rosa Luxemburg. So this was basically what politics was in Weber's times. It was men in suits and occasionally women in frocks trying to get in here, like the legislative assembly. So that's one image of the state, and I think that's basically the image that Weber had in his mind. Now, these are other images of the state. These are from Mexico today. They're all basically Mexican police. These are the municipal police. They look very lovely and friendly. These are the federal police, also very friendly, except he's a criminal. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. These are probably state police, and this is the president with some more police. So this is a different image of the state, quite different from the one of Weber's, I think. Why did I choose Mexico? In short, it's because my wife is Mexican, and we happened to be in Mexico when all the riots took place recently in the UK. My wife said to me, because the riots were supposed to be against the police, because our police are so nasty, so brutal, etc., etc. And my wife said to me, well, basically, I can't understand it, because when I see your police, I just want to hug them. They're, like, lovely and friendly, because this is what Mexican police are like. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of what Mexican police are like. This is Allende in the north of Mexico. It's about a 40-minute drive from Monterrey, which is a city of about 1 million people, one of the largest capitalist metropolises in Northern America. Allende, it's got about 30,000 people in it. Last August, 14 of the town's policemen were arrested for basically working for drug gangs. They were arrested, and 6 of them were arrested for murder as well. They were arrested because 3 young girls were discovered cut up into pieces and left by the side of the road one morning. It turned out that the girls had been partying the night before. They got drunk. The police arrested them in the central square, took them to the police station. There, one of the girls phoned her boyfriend, who was a soldier, and then the soldier phoned the police and said, look, let these girls go, because one of them was with me. Instead, the police phoned up the local drug boss, and he said, okay, let them go in the central square, and then we'll pick them up. And then they picked them up and killed them for having connections to the soldiers. So that's one example from Allende. This is Ciudad Juarez, on the border with Texas. I'm going to read you a little bit from the book of Charles Baudin, his incredible account of Ciudad Juarez, in which he talks about an ex-narco assassin who was also a policeman at the same time. He was an assassin for 20 years, but then he discovered God and etc. So this is the interview. He starts off saying about how he's an 18-year-old police officer, how the drug gangs contact him and say, look, you have to kill someone and then you can work for us. So he kills someone and then he works for him. Then he continues, this was at the start of my career. After I passed my test, for about 3 years, I traveled all over Mexico. Once I even went to Quintana Roo. I always had an official police car. Sometimes we use planes, but usually we drive. We got through military checkpoints by showing an official document that said we were transporting a prisoner. The document would have a fake case number. Baudin says, he becomes a tour guide to an alternative Mexico, a place where citizens are transported from safe house to safe house without any records left for courts and agencies. When he arrives someplace, the person has already been kidnapped. He simply picks him up for shipment. Controlling them was simple because they were terrified. The guy says, when they saw that it was an official car, when I said, don't worry, everything will be fine, you'll be back with your family. If you don't cooperate, we'll drug you and put you in the trunk, and I can't guarantee that you'll see the end of the journey. The drive is fueled by cocaine. He and his partner always dress well for such work. They get 5 or 6 new suits from the organization every few months. They are seldom home, but seem to live in various safe houses and are supplied with food and drugs. But no women. This is all business. They hardly ever do police work. They are busy working full-time for narcos. This business looks almost normal on the surface. Snatch under the guise of police work and they collect money owed to the organization. But the real product is vanishing people. Hardly anyone who is taken ever returns to the world. This is his real home for almost 20 years, a second Mexico that officially does not exist and that operates seamlessly with the government. In his many transports of human beings, the bondage, torture, and death, the authorities never interfere with this work. He is part of the government, the official state policeman with 8 men under his command, but his real employer is the organization. They give him a salary, a house, a car, and stand-in. He estimates that 85% of the police work for the organization, even though on a clear day he could barely glimpse the cartel that employed him. He is in a cell, and above him is the boss, and above that boss is a region of power he never visits or knows. So that's the police in Ciudad Juarez. Now, you could just say, well, this is Mexico. Everyone knows Mexico's crazy, and it's not like that in the rest of the world. But actually, if you look at it, it's very similar in the rest of the world. This map shows a measure of the rule of law around the world in 2009. It comes from World Bank data, in which they managed to quantify various surveys to give a score of the level of lawfulness. I've rebased the data so that Somalia here is 0, and Finland up here is 100. They're the two extremes. You see Mexico's here, and it's like much of the rest of the world. It's not as bad as a lot of places. So this Mexican experience is kind of the norm around the world. Mexico's score on this from 0 to 100, Somalia to Finland, is 44. These are the 11 biggest countries in the world by population. If you look at the world average, in which each country is weighted by population, it's about 53, which is the level of Brazil. In Brazil, there's 45 million people living in slums where the police hardly ever go. 2009 Human Rights Report said that the police in Rio and Sao Paulo had killed at least about 11,000 people over the past 6 years. So there's also a distinct lack of lawlessness in Brazil, lawfulness, sorry, and that's about the average. So what does this image of the police in Mexico have to do with Weber's definition? In my opinion, not very much. Because if a legal order is the definition of the state, then there can't be any state in Mexico, because there's very little legal order. About 1.5% of crimes are prosecuted, is the rough estimate. World Bank also compiled data for corruption here on the vertical scale, and the effectiveness of government here on the vertical scale. And the rule of law in both figures is on the horizontal scale, and each of these is a country in 2009. There's over 200 countries there. And as you can see, there's a negative correlation between the rule of law and corruption. So the more lawful a country is, the less corrupt it is. And there's a positive correlation with effectiveness. So the more rule of law there is, the more effective the government is. In my opinion, the basic problem with a lot of state theory is that state theorists live in these countries here. These are basically northwestern Europe, North America, and Australasia, or Australia and New Zealand. And there's very few working state theorists, at least in the English journal, who live in all these countries here. We tend to come from nice countries like the UK or Canada. Whereas most people live in countries where government is very corrupt, ineffective, and there's no law, or very little law. Now, other alternatives. Probably the most important state theorist in the world today is here in the room with us, Mr. Bob Jessup, Dr. Bob Jessup. This is how he defines the state. The core of the state apparatus can be defined as a distinct ensemble of institutions and organizations whose socially accepted function is to define and enforce collectively binding decisions on a given population in the name of their common interest or general will. Now, key words here, I think, common interest and general will. These are basically the ideas of Mr. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who said that the government had to be subordinate to the general will, which meant the law. Now, the point about this idea was that it was revolutionary. It was used in the critique of the various Louis. He got Louis XVI before he lost his head. And it formed a big part in the French Revolution, eventually becoming incorporated in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. Article 6, the law is the expression of the general will. All citizens have the right to contribute personally, blah, blah, blah. So I think the problem with Dr. Jessup's definition of the state is that it kind of takes the French Revolution for granted, in that it treats the general will as an integral part of the state. So, for instance, it's not much good for examining the state of Louis XVI, or I would argue for examining the state of most actually existing states today. What about even more radical critics, such as Dr. Nitzan and Dr. Biekler? In Capital as Power, their recent book, they define the state, I think, as the mode of power, or the nomos of power, which is the social, legal, historical institutions of power. The nomos, this is the word taken from ancient Greek. It's often just translated as law. And in ancient Greek, it was contrasted with tyranny. So the problem here, once again, is in this redefinition of the state, it's basically got the Weberian legal order. The state is the legal order. It's the institutions, legal institutions of power. It's not much good for analysing tyrannies. I've tried to apply it, for instance, to military dictatorships in Latin America, and it's not so good for that. It assumes the legal order. So, on a more constructive note, what can we look for as an alternative definition? As I said, I'm not a state theorist. I'm a historian, so I can't give you any well-formed argument. But I would suggest that we look towards what the Latin Americans call the Estado de Hecho and the Estado de Derecho. I've tried to translate these into English, but it's very difficult. In part, that's because we simply do not have the concepts of the Estado de Hecho, which can be translated as de facto state or rule of might. Perhaps it's not a very current concept fortunately for us, in the rich countries today. So Latin Americans contrast this, the rule of might, which is like military dictatorships, and with the Estado de Derecho, which is the rule of law, or the de jure state, when the state itself is subject to the law, whereas here the state itself is above the law. So I would argue that you need to separate out law from the state. Thank you very much.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Right, okay. I had some comments on all four papers, but I'm going to focus actually on the last one. I said to my colleague Keen Birch, when you put up your definition of the state from Weber, it's a definition of the modern state. Your second slide showed indeed that it was a definition of the modern state, a quite specific form of the territorialization of political power. And Weber, when he writes on the state, has many other forms of Herrschaft. The modern state, with its territorialized, constitutionalized monopoly of coercion in a given territorial area, is a quite specific form of state. It's not the state. He has analyses of many other kinds of state, many of which would not correspond to that which you are critiquing. If you were to take the work of Nikos Poulantzas, he draws a very clear distinction between the normal state, which corresponds to the Weberian state, and the exceptional state. And most of the states that you're describing could be classified as exceptional states rather than normal states. And there's a very large literature on states of exception within the state theoretical work. And finally, a small comment. If you quote people, you should at least quote them in context. The quotation that you took from my work, in the name of the general interest or common will, is immediately qualified afterwards. In the name of does not mean actually, it means a reference to the illusory interest. And if you look at the illusory interest, that political power is justified in terms of a common good or a common will. I may have used a Rousseau term, but almost all forms of political authority, modern state, pre-modern state, even exceptional regimes, ein Reich, ein Volk, ein Führer will be justified in terms of an illusory representation of a general will or a common interest. In other words, I think you are pushing at a straw man critique in terms of your actual analysis of the fact that most states today, particularly weighted by population, are various forms of rather nasty and exceptional regime. I agree with you entirely, and it may well be that writers on the state in the West or in the North fail to get to grips because they're really thinking in terms of a horizon of OECD states, and in that sense I think your analysis is pushing exactly in the right direction, but I think it would pay to look a little bit more at the theories rather than just actually existing historical realities. Thank you.
Hi Sandy, and hi everyone. Really liked the presentations. Just a couple quick questions for Sandy. Who owns the rest of the debt, the U.S. government debt? I'm just curious who holds the rest of it. That relationship looks remarkably stable for the corporate sector. I'm just curious, is it pension funds or who else? What else is happening there? And I wonder if your future research is going to touch on interest rates and the redistributionary effects of interest rates on essentially redistributing wealth from taxpayers to bondholders, and what high and low interest rates have to do with that. So sort of a technical question.
Thank you. I have 2 points to make. One is to follow up on Bob's comment. You quote from our book the reference to the nomos as the social, legal, and historical institution of society, and you single out the legal as if the rest of the terms are encompassed in that concept. And I think that this is not at all the spirit in which we treat the concept of the nomos. We deliberately began with the social, and we indicated that the legal aspect is important, and we also mentioned the historical. So the idea of power in society and the idea of the state as the mode of power certainly includes the legal, either directly or as the negation of the legal, but it is not a concept that encompasses the notion of the nomos. It's true that the Greek may have treated it as the law, but we are using it in a much broader sense to include things that lie certainly outside the law. So in terms of our discussion of power, it extends way beyond that, I think. And you are entitled, of course, to your own interpretation, but that's not what we have in mind, and I don't think this is what we are actually articulating in our work. So that's just one point of clarification regarding your quote. The other point that I have is a suggestion to Sandy. Your last chart, I'm looking at figure 4, in which you look at the differential government debt and you compare it to differential taxation, and you indicated that you do not have distributional and differential measures for interest payments on the public debt. And I think that there's an easy way around it. It's indirect, but it could be quite effective as a starting point. And that's basically to multiply the debt by the average bond yield. And that will give you an indication of the interest payment. It will not be a direct measure, but it will be pretty accurate over a long period of time. So you can get around it. Thank you.
Thank you. Now responses from the panelists. So I guess it's Joe and Sandy.
Thank you for the comments, and apologies for my impotence in trying to engage with these issues. I'm definitely a historian, and tomorrow I'm going to be presenting on history, not theory. Perhaps the term should be reversed. Perhaps you should call exceptional states the norm, and what you call normal states now is the exception, because historically and geographically, I would say that they're quite exceptional. And by treating them as the norm, you actually kind of negate one of the main elements of progress over the past 500 years, achieving the rule of law, at least in pockets of the world, and it leads to taking it for granted. And because that is treated as the norm, if you look at people from like Latin America, when they come to North American universities and they try and look at Latin American states, they use that norm as the model of what it should be. But I'm And I agree with you, I should read up on it more. Jonathan, I'm not sure what you mean by the negation of the law. It seems to me that you focused on the nomus with very little about violence, even in the case of your account of the feudal state, for instance, which was very violent. You really focus on the legal, cultural, social aspects and the rituals and the symbolism, which so the bits where you actually define the state, I think they can lead to a certain focus which ignores the kind of the violence that should be at the heart of any understanding of what the state is, and which, if you accept the state of capital, is also therefore at the heart of capital as well.
Just to start with Jonathan's suggestion, I hadn't thought of that, and that is very helpful. So thank you. I'll look into it. In terms of Jordan's question about who, for figure 1 about the U.S. corporate holdings of U.S. public debt, who holds the rest of it? I haven't actually looked into it closely right now, but there's also the IRS personal wealth tables, which report personal holdings of public debts, what people do in their personal tax filings. There's also the foreign sector, obviously, and so I'm just guessing that because U.S. corporate ownership of U.S. government debt has been so stable, we know that the foreign sector, mainly because of China, has been increasing its holding of U.S. government debt over the past 20 years. Probably there's been a decrease then in the share reported, at least in the personal wealth tables of the IRS. That's just a guess. I have to look into it. In terms of interest rates and their role in redistribution, I haven't looked at it yet, but there's a whole debate within the liberal literature about the effects of public debt in crowding out capital accumulation, and one of those debates is whether or not, once government debt is issued, whether or not it actually raises interest rates. The problem with that debate, I think, is similar to the debates that we see going on about redistribution. It's overly aggregated, and so yeah, there's a need for a disaggregate power perspective which analyzes not only the relationship between public debt and interest rates, but who benefits from it. So I plan to do it at some point.
Thank you very much for stimulating panel. I have a question for everyone, and I'll try to be brief. I'll start with Joe. Are you saying that we need two state theories, so one for the advanced capitalist states and the other for the rest of the world? And if so, are you saying that Weber's conceptualization of the state is okay for the advanced capitalist countries, it's just irrelevant for the rest of the world? And yeah, I'll leave it at that. Okay. For Francesco, I'm just wondering who manages the Icelandic pension fund. So you've clearly shown that they've exploded over the past 5-10 years. Is it Icelandic banks that have since collapsed in the past 3 years? Is it firms in London, Wall Street? Who manages these pension funds and who is benefiting? So I've looked at lists of billionaires since 1991, and I can't remember a single Icelandic billionaire in the past 20 years. So who is benefiting from these pension funds? Sandy, I think one of your basic points is that bondholders have power over the government. I read in the New York Times a couple months ago, and I haven't looked into this, so I don't know if it's factually correct or not, but they claim that the U.S. government owns over 40% of U.S. government debt. In other words, Social Security, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, et cetera. So what does that mean that the U.S. government owns its own debt? Does the U.S. government have power of the U.S.? Or what does that mean? And you're looking at dominant capital in the aggregate. Have you disaggregated it? So I think that the largest owners, corporate owners of T-bills are Citigroup, Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan, Wells Fargo, and Barclays and UBS, so a British bank and a Swiss bank. So I think it's fairly clear and simple to see the power that executives from Citibank and Goldman Sachs, they have over the U.S. government, because the executives rotate. Robert Rubin was working at Goldman Sachs, made $150 million from there since the 70s, and then once he stepped down as Treasury Secretary under Clinton, he went into Citigroup, right? So I mean, there's a revolving door, so it's quite easy. But what about foreign firms such as Barclays and UBS, which have also a huge chunk of U.S. T-bills. Do they have similar power over the U.S. government? And also, you mentioned foreign governments. So China and Japan account for about 50%, I think, of U.S. Of ownership of U.S. T-bills, of foreign ownership. So in what ways have you seen that China and Japan have increased their power over the U.S. government, and have they been able to affect U.S. policy and so on? I mean, Chinese ownership has only really exploded in the past 5-6 years, but Japan has been, well, it's been dethroned as the #1 owner, but it's been the #1 owner of U.S. T-bills since pretty much the 70s. So in what way has Japan had power over the U.S. over the past, say, 30, 40 years? Theo, you've presented many different aspects of power, relational, structural, discursive, and so on, and it's very interesting, so thank you for that. But I'm wondering how do you measure power? How do you quantify power? How do you determine that one group has more power than another? You know, so, and just to take your case, Europe today, you know, the financial press are characterizing basically the future of Europe as being in the hands of the Bundesbank and Angela Merkel. If Germany doesn't bail out Greece, then the EU will collapse. And the Canadian finance minister earlier this week said in Ireland, you know, if this is pretty much the same thing. If Germany doesn't bail out Greece, then there'll be another global recession. So it seems like the fate of hundreds of millions of people are in the hands of Angela Merkel and the German Bundesbank. But how do you measure that? How do you say that the German government or the various apparatuses within the German state are more powerful than the Greek state or are more powerful than, you know, other social groups? Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
The pension funds in Iceland are managed by the famous pension funds money manager that is elected by the board of the pension funds. And this board is formed by 10 representatives of unions, labor unions, and 10 representatives of employees association. But the problem is that obviously the labor unions has only an indirect control where these funds are invested in. And this.
Thank you. Theo, would you like to respond?
Yeah. Maybe I'll be a bit controversial here, but I don't think you can quantify power. In my kind of understanding of power, I don't think power can be quantified. It's a dynamic. So anything can happen. I mean, in Greece today, you probably will see it in the news tonight. You might have the people storming the parliament. It's very critical today. So power is played in the streets. You know, power is in that respect something very dynamic. What you can quantify or empirically explore is what are called power resources. And you can quantify them in terms of, like Sandy, for instance, you can quantify in terms of, you know, who owns particular things, or, you know, whose capacities are there inscribed in the, you know, you can analyze, for instance, rules and regulations, perhaps, you know, by taking my approach, you know, this approach as a governance as an approach, and you can see through the rules and regulations the logics and whose interests are to some extent served by these logics. It might not be quantification per se, but you can actually see the logic of a particular form of governance and what kind of and whose power resources are enhanced and whose power resources are, if you like, restricted. And that's why I said that, and what we have to understand is that by quantifying power, sometimes we run the risk of not taking a lot of contextual parameters into consideration. Power resources can be mobilized within particular contexts. If the wider context changes, you might not be able to use your resources. The Swedish unions have some resources through their national system of bargaining, through their national industrial relations system, that they were completely undermined by the engulfing of Sweden, if you like, by taking Sweden and putting it into a wider context where an unaccountable court of justice in Europe makes decisions that affect directly what is happening, undermining the historical legacy of industrial relations in Sweden and the power resources that this gave to the Swedish unions. The same applies with the discursive aspects of power. You can see whose categories are continuously dominating the debates. You can read the documents of OECD and World Bank and IMF and see what kind of frames for policy they create. You can see what the European stability mechanism that I mentioned. I didn't have a lot of time to expand. Basically, it almost sets in stone that there's only going to be one policy, and that's austerity measures forever. That's what effectively this institution creates, and it's actually totally disembedded in that respect. It is going to operate outside the EU. So we can actually do this analysis, but I want to leave, if you like, power open in a Castoriadian sense, because to some extent these are all creations, and there might be moments in history. If the Greeks, for instance, do not buy it, something happens and the laws do not pass today, and then that means that they go bankrupt on Monday and euro collapses. That would mean the cards are up on the air again. Something else might happen in Europe. Which direction it will go, it's a matter of volition, social subjects, and all that. But I hope that answers your question. I don't think we can quantify power. That's why I'm resisting using the term having power. Go ahead, Chair.
Okay. No, I don't think you should have two definitions, one for one place and one for the other. I'm a great believer in universal definitions for everywhere and all times. I think the situation at the moment is like, imagine you've got a Dalmatian dog and someone asks you to define a dog, and you say, well, a dog's white with black spots. You actually need to specify what is the characteristics that make all existing states.
Okay, it's difficult for me to respond to the questions because the examples you raised, I haven't actually done any empirical work on them. So what I try to do in my presentation is just give a very limited and what, as I mentioned, modest research project on the linkages between ownership and redistribution within the US corporate sector. And in order to answer all the questions about, because China owns US bonds, how does that give it power? Well, I'd have to quantitatively map it and then weave in a qualitative story. And yeah, you're right, the results could differ from what I've come up with here, but just based on the parameters that I've set out in the presentation, I can't really address the questions. In terms of what you said about the fire sector and naming all the banks, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I have looked at, not at the specific banks themselves, but at the fire sector as a whole, and I think of their share of the corporate sector, if we disaggregate it by sectors, they held something like 90% of government debt in the 1950s, and now that's declined to somewhere in the 80s. So yeah, it's clear that fire dominates, and since it's large corporations that dominate, we can deduce that it's large fire corporations, and so that verifies your account. In terms of the point about internally held debt, government debt that's held by the government itself, that also points to Jordan's question. So thanks for pointing that out, because that's another component of the debt that gets neglected with, or that accompanies the personal wealth tables and the foreign sector for who owns it. And whether or not that government ownership of its own debt gives it power, I guess it probably would. But the point is that it gives the government capitalist power, I guess is the idea. I wouldn't couch it in terms of relative autonomy, although you could, but I think that would be my starting point. So.
Okay. Jonathan wants to make a comment, I think. And then we'll take another question, and then we'll end this session after those two questions and the responses to them. Okay.
I'd like to respond to Joe's question about legality and what do I mean by embeddedness of the illegality or the negation of the law. So, by example, think about criminality in the world, in which governments, as you've pointed out, are deeply involved. What is this criminality? I mean, what is the ultimate goal of this criminality? I suspect that one generalization would be accumulation. These criminal gangs are interested in accumulating claims on future earnings, and I think it's begging research. So if you are to start researching if the data become accessible or you can run estimates and guesstimates, gradually what you will conclude is that all of this negation of the law is part of the state of capital, because all of it gets capitalized, or part of it gets capitalized, and in fact the ultimate goal of every criminal is to go legal. If you've seen the last installment of The Godfather, the whole idea was that I become legit, and then he complains that he's being sucked back into the criminal world. So I think that the illegality, the criminal aspects, which, as you pointed out, involve the state, are very much defined within this concept of the state of capital. And I'm still waiting for the people who are going to do this incredibly difficult research of quantifying, starting to try to estimate the magnitudes that are involved in the dynamics that consist of this criminality. It is a huge task, and it's just waiting for somebody or a group of people to start doing it. Thank you.
I want to give two facts and then raise my question. The French economy at the end of the 18th century depended on income from Haiti. It was a plantation economy. Hawaii, at the end of the 18th century, was a Stone Age economy. In Hawaii, Yankee merchants were eager to encourage debt. And they, in effect, imposed or created Hawaiian national debt. Stone Age economies can't have debt. But they had already begun the integration of Hawaii into the world economy of money. The French, having been kicked out of Haiti with the Haitian Revolution, got even because Jefferson and the rest of the world ganged up on this slave society that had liberated itself and isolated it. And in order to somehow be admitted into the family of nations, France agreed to recognize Haiti if Haiti would incur an immense national debt. So there are these two examples of a kind of, under simpler conditions, at least which I can comprehend because I'm not an economist, the industrialized, the big actors, the big nations, the powers of the day were interested in incurring a national debt in a colony, essentially. Could this be the source of, not an origin myth, but the origin of a national debt in these circumstances might show in a crude way what's concealed, say, in contemporary times where China may be getting an angle on the U.S. debt. It may be muddled, but this is what occurred to me when you were talking.
First is just a comment for Joe. I would suggest maybe taking a look at the anthropologist David Graeber's concept of provisional autonomous zones. And so that idea is that you have large areas of the world where, although they're nominally under the control of some state, the government is generally what people mean when they refer to the state, isn't present in any form. So, for example, in the northern part of Pakistan, until NATO and the West became interested in that region, the Pakistani government had really nothing to do with that region. They weren't there collecting taxes, they weren't there providing services. And Graeber's research was on Madagascar, and he says in large parts of Madagascar that's the case, and what you end up having is those regions have to set up their own rules always conscious that they can be swept away at any moment, which then makes them very aware of the fact that these rules are their creation, which is why he calls it autonomous, autos, nomos, our created law. And part of what he focuses on is that there are positive elements to having the state not be present. And then Sandy, I'm wondering how much that gap between differential taxation and differential debt is due to increasingly sophisticated corporate accounting or is due to changes in the tax law. Like, what were the exact qualitative changes that allowed this increase in corporate power relative to the US government to come about?
Okay, thank you. And I'd like to plead to the panelists to be as succinct as possible in their responses.
Can I make a very quick?
Okay, very quick.
Yep. Just a quick addition to your facts, as a little amusement. The Greek state, the Greeks revolted against the Ottoman Empire in 1821, and the first state that recognized the revolutionary Greek state was Haiti. And the Greek state was allowed to become a state in 1827 when the revolution was defeated by the three great powers, Russia, France, and England, after it incurred a massive debt, exactly as the story that you said in Haiti. Part of the Greek debt that the Greek state is now borrowing money is part of it is capitalized interest, interest upon interest upon interest, from loans that it got in the 19th century. Just to let you know.
I agree with Jonathan that empirical research is needed. Funding is the problem, probably. The autonomous zones, I'd say that it depends on the context and depends on the region. In some places, it's probably good. Probably population density is a big factor. When there's a lot of people in a small space, they tend to fight, and that's when the autonomy might not be so good.
Okay, just the examples of Haiti and France and Hawaii and the Yankees and the Greeks and the Ottomans, I think these are very interesting examples, and it probably is relevant when we try to look at situations like the US and China today, and I plan to look at the international dimensions of this later. That's all I have to say about that. And in terms of Troy's question about whether or not the differential taxation decreases are due to accounting changes or policy changes, something I have to look into, but that's probably a really key part to the story. Perhaps Mladen's presentation in the next panel will tell us a little bit more, because he's looking at taxation in the US banking sector. So,
thank you very much, panelists and audience members, for an excellent opening session.